Good evening, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. Luvi, can you wave your hand if you can hear me? Good, good. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us as we're just letting everybody into the Zoom call here. I'm George Wishart, and I am honored to introduce tonight's speaker, Robin Steinberg, the CEO of the Bail Project. The title of tonight's talk is Reimagining Justice in America. And I can't think of a better person to speak on the topic than Robin. She has spent a lifetime as a public defender in New York City. She is recognized as a leader in racial, social, and criminal justice reform in America. About 15 years ago, and I promise I'm not going to tell your entire story, Robin, because it'll spoil some of your story. But about 15 years ago, Robin and her husband, David Feige, who is a fellow public defender, decided at their kitchen table that justice in America needed to be reimagined. And Robin has dedicated her life ever since to working on changing the system. And it's because there is conspicuous unfairness with a common thread. And the common thread is that most of those that are hurt by the injustice in the criminal justice system are those that are poor and people of color. And it's almost universal. So as a result, I met Robin a number of years ago after reading an article in the New York Times about her work at the Bail Project. And I have been in awe of her vision, her efforts, and her success. But as I say, I promise I will not tell her stories. I couldn't think of a better person to have talk to the Racial Justice Committee at KUC. So with no further ado, Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you. Robin Steinberg.
Thank you so much, George. I appreciate those kind words. And to be very clear, George has been an instrumental part of the Bail Project and bringing us to Cook County and beyond. And he and I have had the pleasure of traveling together, even to Arkansas, to get this project up and running and make sure that we are moving forward justice in this country. But I thought just to start for a minute, I would give you a little bit about my background because I think it is a journey that led me to where I am, and one I think might resonate with some of you on this call as well. You know, I went to law school as a young woman after graduating from college, completely 100% committed that I was going to do women's rights litigation. That was the only thing I cared about. And when I got to law school, I got involved in something called the Women's Prison Project. And honest to goodness, I did not even think about the fact that it had the word prison in it. It was the only course being offered back then in the 1970s that had the word women in it. So I took this course, and what it entailed was me traveling on a daily basis and a weekly basis to visit women at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, which is the maximum security prison in New York. And my job as a law student was to go up there and to travel on the train and to meet the women at the jail that were assigned to us as clients, and to work with them on the issues that they were facing in the jail. So it wasn't about the criminal law, it was about, am I getting adequate health care? What's happening to child custody? Are my kids being brought to visit me? The kinds of civil matters, legal matters that really do plague people in prison across this country. And back then, what we were committed to doing as young clinical students was to go up and meet these women, become their representatives, and work with them on the civil matters. But as any good lawyer does, even a very young law student who wants to become a lawyer, the first thing you really do is you establish a really good relationship with your client and try to understand the context of their imprisonment and the context of their lives and how they see their situation. And I was struck almost immediately by several things. The first was that almost everybody I met was Black and brown. The next was that everybody came from a low-income community. Every woman I talked about the intersection of all the systems that were at play in their lives, child welfare systems, criminal systems. They all talked about how they felt like they had been railroaded by the system, and they all uniformly hated their public defenders. It was kind of amazing. Many of them couldn't even tell me the name of their public defenders. And I was so struck by it and so struck by their stories and listening to them who were toiling away in jail cells for years and years on end. That I became interested in what was happening at the front end of the system. Like, how do people get here and what's going on with the public defender world that nobody cares? And so I threw myself in my third year of law school into the criminal defense clinic and decided I would see what that was about. And I walked into my first criminal courthouse in New York City. And I don't know what I was thinking when I think I had some idea from television because we didn't have lawyers in my family and I didn't really know, but I think I had some idea that these courthouses were beautiful marble columned buildings with smart judges dispensing justice and passionate advocates that were fighting for their clients and wise prosecutors making decisions about justice. And I stepped into my first criminal courthouse in New York City, and no kidding, there were pigeons in the rafters in the arraignment court where I stepped in. And I looked around and I saw what was happening in that courtroom, and it was family members waiting for the doors to open. Everybody was Black and brown. Everybody was just straining to get a view of their loved one who would inevitably be brought out by a court officer to stand before the judge. Inevitably, they would turn around to see their family and somebody would scream at them to look forward, look forward. And there were tears and there was tragedy and there was misery and there was pain and there was trauma. And I looked around and I thought to myself, this is what passes for justice in America? And then I listened to what people were being prosecuted for. And you couldn't have missed the fact that many of the people that were standing in front of the judge, and by the way, the appearances lasted a few minutes. The defense lawyers barely said anything. Most of the conversation was about when was the next convenient court date for the litigants. And the clients usually stood there silently watching. And you couldn't help notice when you heard the charges that folks were being prosecuted for crimes that I knew were going on in every community around New York City, but were really only being policed in theirs. And so I sat there and watched and I thought, it was inhumane. There was no dignity. People were treated in the worst possible ways. And when you see something like that, you have two choices, right? You can walk away and say, I never want to be part of this. I have nothing to do with this, or you can do what I did and throw yourself headlong into it. And I probably have a little bit of a habit of liking to smash my head into cement walls, but that's what I decided to do. And so I threw myself into public defense and I became a public defender in any public defender office that would have me when I first graduated from law school. And I began to stand beside individuals one at a time as the power and terrifying force of the criminal legal system bore down on them, bore down on their families, threatened not just to take away their freedom, but to take away almost everything they had, from custody of their children to their immigration status, to their housing, to their education. Fines and fees were definitely created to take whatever little economic prosperity these families had left. And I stood there next to clients and defended them as best I could. And it was a transformative experience. It was a world-changing experience. It was one I wouldn't trade for anything. The privilege of getting to know each individual client in their full humanity, not defined by their worst moment or their worst act even, but to really get to know them and to really understand what was happening and put their act in context, and to remind myself that I wouldn't want to be judged by my own worst moment or my own worst act. None of us would. And that if it was anybody that I loved or anybody that I knew or even myself, I would want somebody to step in and say, yes, but there may be this act, there may be this moment, there may be, or sometimes not even have occurred, but that's not the entirety of this human being, right? There's a context, there's a story, there's a history. This person is somebody's child or parent or sister or neighbor. And there's a much broader picture to be had. And that's what public defenders do. And that's what I did. And from that vantage point, I got to see our justice system for 35 years. And the most unavoidable conclusion about that was that you could simply not look at any stage of our criminal justice process, and I mean any stage, how we define crime and how we don't, how we police and how we don't, who we target, what we charge them with when they're brought into the system, how once you're in the system it operates, how bail gets set, how sentences get doled out, how prison conditions operate, and the collateral consequences of criminal convictions that will follow you for the rest of your life. You could not help but inherent in every single stage of our system was racism and the legacies of slavery and the legacies of a country that frankly was built upon systematic and systemic racism. And you could not pull that apart from the criminal legal system. It was a tool that not only perpetuated systemic injustice and racism from stern to end, but it perpetuated it, it codified it, it made it worse. And there was really no way to think about that differently. And so I spent 35 years doing that work. And then I started building my own public defender offices. And I built something called the Bronx Defenders with some brilliant colleagues. And we tried to model the very best gold standard public defender office in the nation. I tried to build something in Oklahoma called Still She Rises, which is there still, which I'm very proud of. And the first public defender office in the nation dedicated exclusively to the representation of women with children in the criminal legal system and placed in and serving the women of North Tulsa, which is, as you probably know, the site of one of the worst race massacres in America, the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. And even after building those offices and hiring the best lawyers and training them the way we thought they should be trained and getting the resources we needed, and literally every client having every advocate in every arena swinging for the fences, what I also saw sometimes is it all boiled down to money. And I don't mean the money that it takes to hire a lawyer, I mean bail getting set. And it was from that after all those years of being a public defender, I thought, what's the next thing I want to do after being a public defender? And I'll tell you the secret, which is that I fantasized for a while about becoming a judge. And here is my theory. I figured I had been around long enough, I was late enough in my career, if I could get myself on the bench, I could just start releasing everybody who was brought into the system and not set cash bail, right? Because cash bail seems so fundamentally unfair, right? You're charged with a crime, you haven't been convicted of the crime, no evidence has been brought forth to prove you guilty or not. And the entire premise about whether you're going to sit in a cage while your case is pending, which can last for weeks or months or sometimes years, whether you're going to sit in that cage or whether you're going to be home with your family free, literally was a matter of how much money was in your bank account. And it drove me insane. And so I thought, well, maybe the last stage of my career, I'll become a judge, I'll get on the criminal court bench, and I'll just start releasing people. And I will be a one-woman end cash bail. And then I kind of came to my senses and thought to myself, and I was like, they're probably going to drag me off the bench kicking and screaming in about 6 weeks and put me in traffic court for the rest of my life. So I can't do any good. And so I thought that wasn't really the way to do it. But bail continued to be this outrageous wealth-based detention system that had incredibly disparate impacts on Black and brown communities and low-income people, right? And so one night, and if you saw my TED Talk, you'll know that one night over dinner with my husband, we were ranting and raving about bail, and my husband said, what if we just started paying clients bails and we set up a fund to start paying people's bails? And so in 2005, we decided to incorporate something called the Bronx Freedom Fund. Now it was 2005 and racial and criminal justice was not exactly on people's lips. And so we had this idea, but it took us 2 years to find a single person to give us a single dollar to fund it. And the idea was, because you knew bail came back at the end of the case, if you put it into a fund and you use the philanthropic dollars to pay somebody's bail and they came back to court, at the end of the case, the money would come back into the fund and we could use it to pay people's bails over and over again in the South Bronx, where we both are practicing as public defenders. But of course, nobody had ever tested it. And the entire system of cash bail is built on a myth that it was money that was what brought people back to court. That was the incentive that makes people come back to the court dates. Now I say it's a myth because after 10 years of running the Bronx Freedom Fund, we were able to see that 95% of our clients came back to their court dates. And so we knew that money had nothing to do with it and that was a myth. And that in fact, all it did was create a two-tier system of justice, right? One for people with money, one for people without. So we ran that fund, the Bronx Freedom Fund, for about a decade, and we collected the data and we looked and we saw that, over half the cases got dismissed when we paid bail. That was the other thing we saw. 95% of our clients came back to court. Only 2% of clients ever got a jail sentence on the case they would have sat in jail for the entire time. And of course, what we know is that cash bail, when you look at the data, it has a disproportionate impact on people of color, particularly Black men and women, where bail is more likely to be set, where that bail is going to be 2 times higher than their white counterpart charged with the same crime. That will result in somebody sitting in a jail cell and usually 90% of the time pleading guilty because it's the only way to go home. And the reason it's the only way to go home is cases take a long time to work their way through the system. And so either you're going to stay in jail or the only way to get home is to plead guilty. And prosecutors know it, judges know it. I can't tell you the number of clients I stood up in court and represented where the judge would say, you know, counselor, if he wants to plead guilty today, I'll let him go home. Or if he wants to plead guilty, I'll give him 30 days. And then you have to tell your client, don't take that plea bargain. And then your client says how long will it take to get to trial. And then you have to tell them the truth, which is 6 months, maybe a year, and they have to sit in jail. So the Bronx Freedom Fund was really the first revolving bail fund that laid to rest the myth that it was money. And that was, you know, an incredible revelation. The dismissal rates were even more of a revelation because it really told you a lot about policing and over policing, and whether those cases were sustainable from the beginning, and how little our criminal justice system any longer is about adjudicating facts and justice and the merits of a charge, and how it has become a plea bargain machine, right, in every jurisdiction across this country. And the oil that keeps that machine running is cash bail. Because if people were free and people didn't have cash bail holding them in those jail cells, they wouldn't have to plead guilty to go home. They could work with their lawyers. They could get witnesses on their own behalf. They could make decisions that were based on facts and evidence and justice and not desperation and fear, which is how the current system operates. So I got very, very fortunate, and in 2017 got an email from somebody who I did not know. And this is a very good lesson for if you ever get an email from somebody you don't know, answer it. And it was some young woman named Danielle. I didn't know who she was. And she said, hey, I'm doing a little research about this thing you've been doing, this Bronx Freedom Fund, and wondered if you'd be willing to talk to me about it. I said, sure. I didn't even ask. She said she was a researcher. Okay. And I started asking questions. And then she wrote me another letter. Would I send her a one-pager that explained what we were finding? And sure enough, after about 3 months of answering questions, she disclosed that she actually worked for the TED company, as in TED Talks. And that they had what was then a confidential process where they looked around the world and tried to come up with ideas they thought were scalable that could make real impact. And somehow the Bronx Freedom Fund had come across their radar screen, and they were interested in learning more and in me putting together a proposal to scale the project at a national level. So I got some colleagues together, and of course my husband was with me, and we wrote up a paper, and then I had to make a little video. It was a long, arduous process. And we submitted it. And sure enough, I got a call in July of 2017 saying that the Audacious Prize was being given to the Bail Project, one of 10 winners, and that they were going to give us $22 million to start the project over 5 years. So that was startup funding money, right? So it was 22 spread out over 5 years, and go for it, scale. So the only condition they had was I had to quit all my other jobs. I had to get out of Tulsa. I had to stop running the Bronx Defenders and focus on the bail project. So I did. And it was kind of like I got to be that judge, the one woman end on cash bail, but they couldn't throw me off the bench. So in 2018, we launched, and we started with a very small team that met for many months at my kitchen table in New York City. And as we thought about what does scaling look like and how do you think about this? And in January 2018, we launched. And to date, we have 24 sites across the country. We have over 100 people on our staff. To date, we've paid 15,000 bails for low-income Americans who otherwise would be sitting in jail cells while their cases were pending. We've paid out about $31 million in cash bail across the country. The overwhelming majority of our clients are Black and Brown or from marginalized communities. The one thing we see in every site we're in are the same racial disparities that I saw as that young public defender all those years ago that exist in every community that we're working in and operating in. And the way we operate is this is what we think about. We think about we're paying bail, and in that way, that is the direct service we do. We are a lifeline for somebody who would otherwise sit in jail, and they would lose everything. Their families would be negatively impacted. Their communities are negatively impacted. But that we're paying bail as quickly as we can for as many people as we can with the goal of changing the system. right? So the goal is the direct service work we do really informs the policy work we do. And the policy work is about ending cash bail. It's about systemic reform to end wealth-based detention. It's about systemic reform to address the historic racial injustice of cash bail and every other aspect of our criminal legal system. It's also about promoting leadership and promoting leadership amongst those who've been most impacted by the system, and particularly those who have lived experience in the system. And so how do we do that? So the way we do that is we decide on a site we're going to go to and we're going to operate in, and we build a team, a local team. Whatever site we're in, whatever city we're in, the folks who work as our bail disruptors in those teams on the ground in local communities, paying bail, working with clients, supporting clients, they are from the community that they're serving, right? So that's a very important value for us. We prioritize hiring people who have lived experience or been personally impacted by the criminal legal system in those jurisdictions. And so those are the local teams that do the work. They are the heart and soul of the Bail Project. They really do this work day in and day out. The local teams are supported by what we call the Central Support Hub. That's those of us who operate, about 33 of us. We operate out of Los Angeles, which is where I now live. I moved to California when we launched. And what we have are teams that will provide all of what the back office work and sort of systems and infrastructures that any not-for-profit would need to operate, right? So I had two choices, right, about how I was going to operate this project. And I give Ted a lot of credit for this, the TED folks that I worked with there. The two choices were raise a lot of money and then distribute it to local jurisdictions across the country and let everybody set up separate 501c3 not-for-profit organizations to do this work, or handle the money centrally, create a central hub, and hire local teams who lead the work on the ground, but that we're all part of a cohesive organization, and make sure that the support infrastructure that we have supports all the local teams so that everybody can thrive. And so what I mean by that is we collect data, right? Data is a very important piece of what we're doing, and I'll get to why in a minute. We have a 5-person data team. That data team works with every single local site in the country. We have a communications team. We have a team that oversees the National Revolving Bail Fund, right? And disperses funds on an as-needed basis to local jurisdictions. We have leadership training. We have HR. So we have all of the things that any not-for-profit might need, but we can support our local teams. And then we don't have to put up brick and mortar. We don't have to recreate the systems each and every time, and that we're flexible and we're nimble. And why is that important? Because our goal is to put ourselves out of business. And I mean that. And I don't say that facetiously. I don't say it as a hashtag. I genuinely mean that. And because if we put ourselves out of business, I know that we have actually succeeded at making sure systemic reform moved forward and cash bail ended or was significantly altered and used less often. And we can then exit the site, right? So we go into a site, we work as hard as we can, we get out as many people as we can, we collect the data to understand how many people are coming back and why. What are the obstacles that get in people's way that prevent them from coming back to court? What happens to case dispositions? Is it the same in the Bronx? Do the results look the same? Do cases get dismissed? We collect that data because if you're going to move systemic reform forward, right, I personally think you need two things. You need data to support it, but you also need human stories. So the data team collects the data, so we have that as we're trying to move systemic reform forward. And we have a communications team and somebody who works with our clients to really elevate the stories of our clients, to elevate the stories of communities and how they're being impacted by cash bail and the devastating consequences of involvement in the criminal legal system, and particularly around cash bail. And so the idea is with those two things operating together, as we continue to operate in each jurisdiction, we partner with local elected officials, systems players, grassroots organizers, not-for-profit service providers, and we think about how moving together, we can ensure that there is going to be systemic reform and that the use of cash bail ends one jurisdiction at a time. And that's how we put ourselves out of business. we keep national statistics, right? And so we're the only organization that does around cash bail. And what we see is that, the other question when we started this was, is it going to look like the South Bronx Fund? Maybe the Bronx is pretty unique generally. You can just tell by the way I talk, right? It's generally New York City doesn't represent a lot of jurisdictions around the country, but will we see the same things in 24 different sites? And the answer is, yeah, pretty much. You've seen the same racial disparities. You see clients return to 90% of their court dates. You see dismissal rates that are anything from 20% to 57%, depending on the jurisdiction you're in. Meaning once we intervene and pay cash bail with philanthropic dollars, cases get dismissed either 1 out of 5 times or higher, depending on where we are. And we continue to sort of raise money for the revolving fund, expand where we're going in terms of sites, think about how we're moving towards systemic change in this country, and really think about the way we can change the criminal legal system. So I like to think that bail is, and I said this before, it's like the oil that keeps the machine of the criminal legal system operating. But honestly, you could intervene at almost any part of our criminal legal system and make a huge impact and a tremendous difference. And in some ways, I think I've spent my whole career trying to think about what's the answer? What's the answer to fixing this horrendous system that reflects systemic racism like so many of our institutions in this country? The criminal legal system is a particularly onerous one because it has literally been a tool that has been used to perpetuate systemic racism. It is literally a tool that has harmed generations of people from low-income communities of color. It is a tool that operates in all of our names, right? So when prosecutors stand up in a courthouse and they say, here for the people of the state of Illinois, here for the people of the state of New York, here for the people of the state of Oklahoma, that is being done in all of our names. And what our legal system looks like should reflect our values as a nation, right? It should reflect the things we say about ourselves, equal justice under the law, right? It should reflect what we want to see rather than what we do see. And so when I think about, the place of most impact, could I do it here? Could I do it in bail? Could I do it in public defense? I've been seeking that answer. And I realized probably very, very, very well into this project that the answer is not bail. There is no one answer. And there is no one place. You can pick the place you want to operate, and I'm operating in bail because it prevents some of the damage, I think, that happens in the long term to people who are held in jails, and maybe even prevents people from going to prison ultimately or being convicted. But that really the criminal legal system and how it operates as a tool of racial injustice, as a tool of continued oppression of certain communities, it's like a tapestry of horribles, and you can pull at any one thread, right, and try to dismantle it, but those threads will really try to hold on tight, right? Systems will not go down without a fight. They will fight for their lives. And you can try to pull on the thread of bail, and what you might see is the recreation of a new system to replace cash bail with a system just as bad if you're not really, really vigilant and really thinking in a very, very careful way about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. And when I think about it, I think that, at the end of the day, we can talk about the systems that are operating. We can talk about the systemic injustice and racism that exists in these institutions and systems. We can talk about the roots that they come from. You can read Michelle Alexander's brilliant book, right, about the roots of slavery and how it relates to mass incarceration, or go to Brian Stevenson's, museum at EJI in Alabama and see the literal lane from slavery to mass incarceration. But that I think about, no matter how hard we can change those systems, right? And something that looks like reform and looks like real progress, it may very well be progress, right? It may very well be really, really good change. But that at the end of the day, I think I've become more and more aware that we really won't get there where we want to get in one generation. This work went on, the work for racial justice went on long before I was here, and it's going to go on long after all of us are here. It is a continuum. It moves slowly. Somebody once very wisely said, if you're thinking about a problem that you can solve in your lifetime, you're probably not thinking big enough. So it is a continual struggle, one that, we need to continue to engage in and think about who came before us and who's going to come after. But also at the end of the day, I don't really think that systemic change lasts unless we really, really begin to grapple with who we are. And I don't mean that y'all have to go to therapy, although that's always a good thing. I mean, sort of really who we are when we think about ourselves as a nation, who we are when we think about ourselves individually, how when we look in the mirror, we really begin to understand the systems that were built that many of us stood on and benefited from and profited from and were advantaged by, and who was left behind or disadvantaged by those systems. It's about grappling with how we think about punishment. It's about grappling with how we think about flaws, how we think about people disappointing us. It's about thinking about how we understand punishment and what it is that drives our thirst for revenge. It's about trying to really work, I think, on an individual personal level, as well as a broader community level, and as well as a systemic level, about how we respond to harm or violence or disappointment or flaws, and how we begin to shift our lens from isolation and punishment to support and restoration, how we think about jails and imprisonment and torture, and how we shift our lens from thinking about how that's a way to respond to those things, and we really begin to think about how do we repair harm, how do we address trauma, how do we think about restoring not only individuals but communities that have been harmed. It's an entire shift of the way we think about punishment and why we punish and what it does. I say to people all the time, if we could incarcerate our way out of the problems that we see in this country, we would be the most successful country in the world, right? Like, we incarcerate more people than anybody in the world, and yet we see some of the worst systemic racism, some of the worst economic disparities. We see terrible health outcomes. We see terrible educational outcomes. So incarceration clearly hasn't worked, but somehow we latch on to the idea that handcuffs and patrol cars and police officers and jails and prisons and punishment and solitary confinement are the answers to what are fundamentally the social problems that confront all of us. Whether that is poverty, whether it's mental illness, whether it's addiction, whether it's systemic racism, and that we aren't going to solve those problems in that way. It's never been successful. It doesn't work. And it's time to really give it up and reimagine a way that we engage around these issues in an entirely different way, and stop relying on the dumb, blunt instrument of a criminal legal system, right? Handcuffs and patrol cars and jails and prisons, and begin to really reimagine what a justice system would look like. I don't think we'll get there until something very, very fundamental happens to all of us, right? Which is that we have to begin to be able to see ourselves in the people that are ensnared in our criminal legal system. And we need to begin to see our children in their children. And if we can't see that, if we can't look in the mirror and move ourselves and our souls and our morality and our sense of humanity in that way, I think we're doomed to keep recreating the same systems over and over and over again. They're just going to look different. And that's not where I started a few years ago. I would have said, we could just change the bail system. Maybe I'm getting older, maybe I'm getting smarter, maybe it's a combination of both things, but I have really begun to realize that this is a very, very deep, soulful, moral, perhaps religious issue that all of us have to dig into in our own personal ways, in ways with our community members, and in ways, I think, as a nation. And when we do that, I think we have the real potential for systemic reform of our criminal legal system, for ending the kinds of racial injustice that infects every single institution in this country, and really begin to recognize the harm. And once we actually can do that, maybe we can repair it. Maybe we can restore people. And maybe we can begin to really grapple with our history so that we can move forward in a really different way. I can keep talking, which I'll do if you'd like me to, but I also would love to hear from all of you. I'm from New York, and I can talk without breathing, so I'll just keep on going.
Yeah,
but
Robin, I should have warned them that once you get wound up, you just let her go.
I'm there. I'm all there. And
let me jump in for a couple
down.
minutes, because I think you've just basically written half of Bill's next sermon. So thank you for that.
Great.
But there are a couple of technical things I think the folks here would love to hear more about. And that is, you talked about going to various jurisdictions. One of the ones that I know very well because of our work together is Chicago. And I thought it would be interesting for everybody to hear a little bit about what we're doing in Chicago, but more importantly, what happened during the pandemic that only the Bail Project could do. And I'll give a little hint to everybody. I mean, literally, Kim Fox and the Public Defender's Office and Tom Dart, who usually are at each other's throats, came together and said, we've got a major problem. And they turned to Robin and her team, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. And
Sure.
Second of all, there's a huge movement afoot right now in criminal justice and social justice reform. You know, the legislation that just got passed in Illinois. And I'd love you to talk a little bit, you talk conceptually about how to think about legislation, but there's been legislation in New York, there's been legislation in New Jersey, there's been legislation now in Illinois, and of course, there was major legislation in California. Talk about, if you could talk about that for literally just 2 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And what we'll do at that point is we'll turn off the recording and let people ask you questions.
Great. So, you know, when COVID hit and we all saw what was coming, right? Which is you have a potentially lethal disease that is going to hit jails and prisons in this country where people have no possibility of social distance, no possibility of access to healthcare or protective gear. And we knew what was going to happen, and it could literally turn somebody being in jail on a larceny case from stealing diapers to a death sentence, and it was intolerable. And people were moving as fast as we could in the middle of this crisis. And we were very, very lucky in Chicago, and in large measure because of the work that George and others have done to get us there. You know, we have always been inside outside players. So we work very closely with the systems players, right? I may not like the systems that are created, but some of the individuals that work in those systems are quite magnificent. And when they come together, they can do incredible things. And so what we did was we worked with our partners there in Cook County who wanted to get people out of jail, to decarcerate those that they could when COVID was hitting the jails. And they came to us and said, can you do this? Can we work together to get out as many people as possible? And we did. And our teams from across the country, because we were able to work remotely, actually came together. And so it was not only our team in Chicago working, but also teams from around the country who really came together. And in that first month, working with partners, got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people out of jail. We've probably paid bail for over 1,000 people in Cook County in less than 2 years. And so it was a real Herculean effort and humanitarian, success to be able to at least get in there and get as many people out as we could. Of course, we couldn't get everybody out, but working with, the prosecutors, the public defenders, the sheriffs, we tried as best we could and paid a lot of bail for a lot of people. We continue to do so as COVID continues to be a seemingly intractable problem in jails and prisons. There has been bail reform, and the beauty of it is that when you work long enough and hard enough, sometimes systems actually will change. And so in New York, they passed statewide legislation, and that was a long time coming, a combination of our work, lots of other grassroots organizers, not-for-profits, local elected officials, policymakers, public defenders, all came together and moved the law to change in New York that ended the use of cash bail for many classifications of crimes, not every classification, but most. and drastically decarcerated the pretrial population. And when I say that, I mean people that haven't been convicted of crimes yet, who are just there in cash bail. So that's happening in New York. We exited New York. So our Bronx Freedom Fund closed its doors, right? Because we figured we did as well as we could do there. The need changed and we moved on to another jurisdiction. New Jersey passed actually statewide bail reform before New York did and saw a huge decrease in incarceration rates. And Illinois just passed its real statewide bail reform legislation that I don't think has been signed by the governor yet, but every indication is the governor is going to sign it, which is going to eliminate the use of cash bail and create a different kind of system entirely, so you won't continue to create wealth-based detention. And so there's a lot to be proud of. California was a fascinating example of what can happen when a bail bill goes really badly. So there was something called SB 10 in California. Coalitions of people came together to get it passed. By the time it came out of the closed doors of negotiation and compromise, the bill was one, quite frankly, that most of us couldn't support. And so we were in this position as the bail project, right? Here we are in California, it ended the use of all cash bail. And what were we going to do about it? So California has a very strange way of putting things that have passed the legislature back on the ballot with 400 signatures for the citizens of California to vote on. And that's what they did here. So the bail bond industry got together, got 400,000 signatures, took SB 10, the bill, and put it back on the ballot for Californians to vote on this November. And it was quite a debate because it did end the use of cash bail, but in analyzing the bill, we certainly felt like we couldn't support it. And most other organizations and partners we worked with also couldn't support it. And it actually was defeated. And so we still have cash bail in California. But what was interesting about that bill was it ended the use of cash bail. And this is important, but its entire system was built on risk algorithms, algorithmic risk assessment tools that all of the researchers out there, don't take it from me, the advocates, take it from the social scientists and the data scientists. What everybody basically said was these tools will recreate the same racial injustice that we have always had. They will decarcerate numbers of people in the pretrial context, but they will not move the needle on racial disparities. They will not move the needle on racial injustice. And frankly, this bill was all being talked about in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the Breonna Taylor murders and the uprisings we saw in every place in this country. And we just thought, we just can't support a bill that isn't going to move the needle on racial justice. It's not okay to say, well, it'll do this, we can fix it later when it comes to racial justice. We felt like we couldn't. Almost every not-for-profit and grassroots organization in California also stood against SB 10 moving forward. And actually, Californians voted it down. So now we're in the process of working along with partners and legislators and local elected officials and organizers throughout California in trying to recreate a better bill that will eliminate cash bail, but not allow racial injustice and those racial disparities to not only continue, but to be further codified and perpetuated. And so that's our big challenge in California.